All right, cool. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Where are you actually located at the moment? Obviously, there's a bit of a blower in the background.
In Sydney. So yeah, I work at UNSW,
Okay.
University of New South Wales, in the School of Economics, which I'll say at the end when we do the interest.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I literally live like 12 minutes walk from the campus, and I like to do the podcast here because, my gosh, the lighting's bad, the connections are variable, and every once in a while you get random students wanting to talk, and oh God knows, so many distractions. So I end up being at home quite a lot, unfortunately, because I do a lot of these podcasts and interviews and stuff. And so yeah, that's right.
There's nothing like a university campus lighting. Like in those old buildings, my mum used to do a lot of work at one of the unis here in WA, and it's just like, they're the strangest environments to me. There's quiet.
Yes.
There's a certain quiet that, yeah.
Well, so while you're before we start, maybe give us a bit of a rundown on how you've got to where you are and what's led you to why you're on the podcast today.
Okay, so are we? You want to actually start talking about stuff now? Okay. I thought we were just chatting. So basically, I'm a professor at UNSW at the School of Economics, and for a long time I've done sort of research that is not necessarily, I suppose, in favor in relation to mainstream or large institutions. And that's really been a consequence of my interests. I'm interested particularly in social influence and group behavior, so how groups influence people's behavior, but also very much in trying to design and advocate for policies that I think are on balance likely to be good for people, the whole people of Australia, or whatever country it is that's setting policy. So when I studied in university, I was studying kind of a broad social science area, ethics, politics, and economics. It's kind of like a PPE program, so not straight econ, which I think gives me a bit of a broader perspective on a lot of the policy discussions and, general kind of philosophy about what we should be doing with our resources in a country. And then, of course, got my PhD in economics. But a lot of the stuff that I did even before COVID was, like, for example, I studied international students and how well they were doing in universities here in Australia. Not a very popular, area, maybe from the perspective of some of the universities that rely very heavily on international students. And I did find that, on average, they do worse than domestic students by a few marks, and that larger fractions of international students in a classroom tend to bring down marks in that classroom, and also there's grade inflation. So these things that, it's not to blame international students, but just to say this is the impact of our settings in this area, our institutional settings. So we need to be aware of that because, any policy you make, you want to make it on the basis of projected positive net benefit for the people. I wasn't seeing that in that case. And I've also studied corruption and power and love and loyalty. So things that are, again, not really traditionally the sorts of dynamics or phenomena that you would traditionally associate with economics. But then when COVID came around, of course, I found myself thinking very clearly at the very beginning in March 2020 that, well, this looked like a kind of a nasty flu for the older people. And why were we locking everything down? It just seemed completely crazy to me. And I did have, maybe a couple days where I was thinking, geez, should I be really that frightened? Everybody's freaking out, because is there something here? But, I sanity checked with my friends, family, everything, and started to basically advocate for the loosening or the removal of lockdowns as early as I think it was late March 2020, because at that time I had a talk radio show on ABC Radio National with Peter Martin. And I just, blurted out that I thought we shouldn't be having the lockdowns. And that caused the jaws of Peter and my producer to sort of drop to the floor. And then I realized, okay, something else is going on here. This is not just about making the right decision for the country. A psychological phenomenon is happening here. And of course, it was a great deal of fear coupled with this sort of narrow focus just on COVID and on this notion that somehow the lockdowns were the right response, even though they'd never been proven. So I found myself just advocating for what I thought was a completely common sense approach for 5 years, certainly very heavily for about 2 or 3 years. And it's become, of course, more fashionable to take positions against the mainstream COVID policy in the last couple of years, but it's been a long road. And during that really intense period, I was defamed on what was then Twitter, even though I've never had a Twitter account. I was called a neoliberal Trump cannot death cult warrior. I was called a piece of human excrement. I was denigrated and just really, people tried to cancel me in various fora. And I had multiple people refuse to take a stage with me to discuss, respectfully what was going on and what the costs and benefits were. I was on ABC Q&A many times. I was on radio programs and, wrote op-eds and founded a think tank, co-founded it with a bunch of other professionals across different disciplines, Australians for Science and Freedom. And now I pour a lot of effort into that, as well as just continuing to advocate for kind of a reckoning with what happened during COVID, because we have huge scars in this country from that experience, and we really have not come to terms with that yet. And we have these rifts between people, sometimes within the same families. Certainly, in my profession, a lot of people just don't want to talk about COVID anymore, and they don't want to talk to me. And I think, that's a function of what happened during COVID. So we kind of need to reconcile our differences and come to the table and have a conversation and understand how much destruction was caused by those COVID policies. I mean, it is an eye-watering amount, and we just haven't had that conversation yet. So hopefully we will, but probably a few years yet, I think.
That's really quite inspiring to hear someone like yourself taking that stance in the position. It's very easy for someone like me in this podcast to take this stance, but I'm a commentator. I have no real impact on what's going on. I have no expertise. People can yell and carry on however they want with me. But with you, someone who's a professional, how does that feel to be like being told that, no, you're not allowed to have these opinions?
Oh, I just find it farcical, honestly. I mean, I think I've said this on other podcasts, but I think I may be missing some of the wiring that makes most people really react badly when they're called names or people try to exclude them or, suppress them. I just find that to be adjudicative in relation to the person who's taking that action. Why would you call another human being a granny killer? Like, that's just nuts. And I know I'm not trying to kill grandmother. I mean, I have perfect clarity on my own motivations. So I know for sure that's not me. So it's like, right, what are you doing? Why are you saying that? What is your worldview at this moment? What's possessing your brain? And so that really enabled me. That's a weird thing, I guess, about myself, which I've learned a little bit, over the period about, I guess, the idiosyncrasies of my own character relative to a lot of other people. And so it really hasn't hurt me that much. I've had the great love and support of family and some of my closest co-authors, and that has been huge. If I hadn't had that, I think that would have been, much worse for me. But I'm kind of, I don't know. I've been pretty confident that it was, even if I wasn't right about what I was advocating for, that just doing the advocating itself was a pro-social move, because so much of the discussion was one-sided. Just we have to lock down, we have to mask up, we have to have social distancing, we have to have the vaccine, we have to have this. It's like, this is a little tedious. Can we please have a different opinion? So it's just better for society to have a few different ideas floating around. So I just thought I was doing something that was good. And so I had no problem continuing to say it. And, as I say, there are ways in which I have, I guess you could say, suffered. Like right now, it's very difficult to get research about the things I would like to research into mainstream journals. And so I find myself publishing things like book chapters or, research on something totally not about COVID. In order to keep the CV ticking along, right? So that's one thing. I know that the government in Australia is probably not ever going to give me another grant. Yeah, okay, well, such is life. But I've poured effort into other things. Again, in Australians for Science and Freedom. I also started in 2022 with another collaborator, the Australian Economics Olympiad, which is a high school competition for students in economics. And now I also run the Australasian version of that, Australasian Economics Olympiad, which is a regional competition. So that's fun. That's one of the things that's coming up in the next week. And, so that I kind of have other things I'm doing now that have, in some sense, been a reaction to it's basically because I've had some displacement in what I've been able to, productively or effectively produce as a professor. So, but I just sort of take that on the chin. That's how it goes. Fortunately, I have tenure, and I'm very grateful to UNSW for not canceling me during this period. I never got any statement from anyone at any level of authority at the university saying that I should not say what I was saying. It certainly no threat to my job or anything like that. And I've considered reasons for that. A lot of other people who have spoken out really were punished for that professionally in much more serious ways than I have been, including being fired. But, I'm not sure why. I have some thoughts, but anyway, I'm very grateful to them. And so I just keep doing, the things that I think are useful and helpful, and hope that eventually we will get to a place where Australia can talk about what happened.
Yeah, well, that's great to see people like you continuing to do that. I'm just going to quick, is that still going in the background?
It's kind of beautifully coming back.
It is, but apparently it's almost done. But I will also say I did another podcast a few weeks ago with this same software, I believe. And it started to indicate that there was background noise, even though there was nothing in the background on my side. This was with a guy in the UK or whatever. So anyway, he's just stopped the leaf blowing. So hopefully that reduces the background noise, but you may see it anyway for some weird reason.
That's
basically like you said it and it stopped.
Yeah, I said it and it stopped. So you've been perfect since. So all good. But yeah, no, that's great. So what sort of things were you saying initially that was sparking such outrage? Were they just very standard things? I mean, we were shut down for reading the World Health Organization's own definitions on their websites, for example. That seems absurd.
I know. It's totally absurd. I mean, I thought it was quite obvious that lockdowns were going to have costs. Having whole huge amounts of people who are healthy and otherwise would have liked to have gone to work and school and the pub and whatnot, unable to do those things, is clearly going to reduce their welfare. And in the longer run, what are you actually trying to achieve? You're trying to keep people away from each other, but people need to have food. They need to, interact a little bit somehow around the edges. And so we're not like a hunter-gatherer society. We're not in a walled city. We can't really expect that a lockdown, as we were implemented, here in Australia, it was really going to completely stop the spread of a respiratory disease. And even if you thought that it would, why is that necessarily a good thing? This disease was not that dangerous. What you wanted was to, and I said this many times, to design your institution such that the people most likely to be exposed to the COVID virus were those least likely to experience significant problems from that exposure, i.e. the young and healthy. So actually, we should have let the young and healthy out there, in my view, and, tell them, of course, what the deal was. So if they, wanted to take precautions, they could. I'm a big believer in human, autonomy. But the idea would be to protect the elderly because they were the ones who were at risk. Yeah. And we just comprehensively failed to do that. Yeah. So I said that a lot, and it's just the cost of lockdowns were so obvious, and they were not proven to work as a scientific approach ever, right? They were basically not even considered viable in the pandemic management policies that we had at the start of 2020, right? As I'm sure you know. And so it was just this bizarre invention of something based on nothing, and basically making stuff up.
We see this.
I just thought, man, gotta call that out.
We see this hyperinflationary cycle at the moment, and it's not like it was very difficult to predict. If they're going to print trillions of dollars of new money to go into society, pay us, I can't remember what they're paying us, like $700 a week or something to stay at home and do nothing while like what did they expect was going to happen? The idea that the cure is worse than the disease has always been a big part of this, and now we're seeing it play out in real time, but they're pointing at all these other issues to deflect from their own lack of real sort of educated decision making. But that sort of brings us to what we've got you on for, which is specifically we've had 2 episodes. This is a part 3 where we're talking about the pandemic treaty and specifically the cost of that sort of scenario and what that's going to do in a multiple a variation of ways. But the cost of living is a big part of that. The cost to the Australian people. So can you break down a few things when it regards to that and the pandemic treaty?
Yeah. So as we know, the pandemic treaty stipulates certain kinds of actions that the signatories have to take if, the WHO decides to call certain things, particularly bad news, let's say. And so there's this primary fear that the normally sovereign decisions that Australian governments would make over how to spend the resources that they have would be hijacked by directives from the WHO. And so we don't know exactly what level of cost we are potentially dealing with. I mean, it probably would be, the potential is there for it to be very large, depending on what the WHO decides to do. That's one of the reasons. I mean, it's kind of like an unfunded, uncertain mandate. We just don't really know how much we might be asked to shovel out. We have some, kind of guidance from what's happened in the past. And if you look at what happened during COVID, there was, as we say, hundreds of billions of dollars that we spent that we now can't spend on other things. So if we think about how to conceptualize costs in this kind of case in relation to the pandemic treaty or in relation to the lockdowns or any other kind of policy that we make allegedly to, promote health, whenever you spend a dollar in economics, you're not spending that dollar on other things. So the first sort of cost area to recognize is that the sort of decision holistically to spend in a particular area mechanically implies that you're giving up good things in other areas. So that was actually one of the first things I was worried about with the lockdowns, was that because we were spending so much on JobKeeper, we weren't spending on, let's say, for example, healthcare, right? Or education or so many other things. And if we went into debt, as we did, to finance that expenditure, that fiscal expenditure, then we were simply kicking the can down the road and requiring future generations to pay that back. And again, paying back the debt means you're not using those dollars that you're using to pay back the debt on other things that could make people better off. So ultimately, what we care about in economics is that better off notion, that welfare, happiness, thriving, whatever you want to call human flourishing, human happiness, or satisfaction with life is one way to try to maybe measure it most holistically. And in fact, there's a currency I used when I did a cost-benefit analysis of the lockdowns in Australia that used that very currency, this life satisfaction currency, basically. There's a particular thing called a Wellbe that was invented a few years ago, and I was able to use that. And using that, you can basically put all of the different costs that you are expecting from something like the lockdowns, let's say, into one, kind of as like an apples to apples comparison. They're all in one denomination. And so we had, for example, the mental health damage of being locked down. We had the, damage because of lost GDP and the rising debt, which was not going to be able to, then mean that we had as good a future as we would have otherwise, because we were going to have to pay it back instead of paying on other things. There was the crowded out healthcare and the well-being costs of that, people not getting their cancer screens and all that sort of thing. And, disrupted schools, all of these things could be denominated in some way that was translatable into this life satisfaction. So then what I was able to do with my co-author on that book was to quantify how much total welfare in terms of life satisfaction people report was expected to be lost from these COVID policies. And then, of course, how much was expected to be gained from, the lockdowns. Because, of course, there was this claim that there would be gains. And in fact, the only assumption in that book that we make that doesn't have a scientific basis is the assumption that lockdowns would save lives, because there was no evidence for that. But there was evidence for a lot of other things. We knew that taking kids out of school was going to deplete their future learning, their human capital acquisition, their future wages, and therefore their future thriving, right? So through means like that, you can quantify both sides of the sort of equation of costs and benefits from a particular action you could take. Now, in relation to the pandemic treaty, that's the way that I would think, right? So if we approach that and say, okay, first of all, we're going to be spending money on a whole raft of measures that are allegedly about promoting health, but I've not really seen any evidence that those measures are going to promote health. Health is generally something that's created at the local level, right? It's created through good nutrition, good sleep, immune support, healthy family relations, sort of optimistic outlook, feeling good about yourself, motivated, all that stuff. But those kinds of positive health inputs, they happen locally. They don't happen in Geneva. So this notion that somehow if we spend more because of some edict from Geneva, that's going to get us more health than we would otherwise if we just made sovereign decisions ourselves about where to invest in health, to me is just prima facie ridiculous. That's not how you create health. You create it by investing at the local level, community level, family level, state level, maybe regional level. And you don't necessarily even spend the health dollars you've got in the ways that we've seen Australia spending health dollars recently, right? Maybe not quite so many hospitals, maybe more community nurses. There's lots of ways I would change that expenditure. But one way I wouldn't change it is to spend more on something that is being dictated to from above, because in expectation, that's going to be worse for us than what we do ourselves, looking at the ground locally at the coalface, which is where health is created. Yeah. So prima facie, I don't see a benefit. Now, what are the costs? Huge costs in terms of actual monetary expenditure if the WHO requires us to spend on particular categories like tracking and tracing, or sending pathogen results, or sending money to developing nations so that they can get vaccines or something like that, which definitely seems like something that is on the cards. And all that stuff doesn't benefit Australia that I see, again, compared to a situation in which we would actually make our own decisions about those things. What are the costs? Well, monetary costs, A. B, all of the things that we wouldn't be able to spend on because we're spending on that. So again, what we call the opportunity cost. If we're spending a lot of money to send vaccines to Botswana or something, then that's money that we're not spending to make Australians better off in whatever way we want to, whether it's better education, better roads, more infrastructure, whatever the thing is that we would otherwise sovereignly choose to spend our money on. Well, so that, from my perspective as an economist, I don't see it stacking up. I see it being an unfunded mandate, and with no argument about why this is actually a good idea. And certainly after COVID, I think there's every reason to think it's not a good idea.
It seems to be they're putting the money into a cure, or something that you can do post the situation instead of prevention. And I think prevention's always the best cure. So prevention is usually education, educating people on the best way to be healthy, to avoid certain health conditions and what they can do in the event of such things. Is there any move at all from Australia to put any sort of money into this sort of education?
I don't think that is something the politicians are thinking about. If you look at what happened during COVID, there was no effort to educate people in actually how dangerous this virus was, to align expectations towards reality. Yeah. There was an effort spent to tamp up fear, right? I mean, they hired that young female actor to pretend like she was, suffocating in the hospital ventilator. I remember that very strongly. I mean, talk about manipulation. That was so offensive, and all just to supposedly, freak people out and make them think, oh my gosh, anybody can get this thing, so I better comply, right? It's horrific how people were manipulated by their own government. And that's not an attempt to educate the people, right? If you really wanted to educate the people, you need to get out there and give advice about nutrition and, encourage people to go exercise and do this and do that. And you sometimes do see, governments giving a little lip service to that. But if you look at the way in which our doctors are trained, there's hardly any emphasis on nutrition. There's not much emphasis on the holistic person. The questions you get if you go in with a medical problem are usually to do with, are you allergic to any medicines? And, what might you potentially be in for in the future based on your family history? But you don't usually get questions about, are you feeling good about your life? How frequently do you exercise? How's your diet? It's very rare to get those kinds of questions from, a GP trained in Australia. So if we wanted to reorient our health expenditure towards education of people about how to prevent health problems and support their own health, then the scale of change that we would need to implement would be massive. I do hope to see that, maybe in my lifetime. I am kind of, as part of what I do at ASF, trying to design what would a new health system really look like. Get very practical about this so that we have blueprints on the table available when Australia is ready and has the appetite to actually consider this. But that is ultimately, I think, the way that the future is headed for nations that recognize that that's actually how to produce more human thriving and be able to liberate more dollars. I just don't think we need to be spending as much on health, but we need to be spending it in different ways.
Looking at costs, because I'm super interested in talking about the kind of social cost and I guess the kind of mental cost as well in our society. But just speaking financially, obviously with the treaties, the numbers are quite broad, but seem limitless in terms of just the amount to keep the framework running, let alone if we were to have a fake event or pandemic-like event that's significant. How do you see, I mean, from an Australian national perspective, and I guess more also from a global perspective, like how sustainable does it seem as a framework with what's been put out so far? If we were to have, say, 2 events like this in the next couple of decades, because I mean, we've walked away so wrecked from this one, and now we're staring down the future of perpetual scenarios like what we've just come through.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And I think, unfortunately, that we still have it too good in Australia for people to recognize that we really have to change course. That's why I think it's going to take a few more years before we really get serious conversation about what happened and interest in alternative system design. And there's so much surplus that's still created in Australia that can basically just be, drawn upon. And I'll give you one example. So one of the kind of trapdoors that the Australian government used during COVID, and they'll use it again, I'm sure, is the superannuation system. Pretty much every working Australian has a superannuation account, and we're not allowed to access it because daddy says no until we're whatever age, right? And what happened during COVID is there was an emergency measure passed that said, okay, if you're really being negatively affected by what's going on, you can tap into your super little children. It's okay. That is exactly what will happen again if things get bad enough because of the pandemic treaty expenditures or any other mistaken, fiscal policy that gets implemented. And unfortunately, because of that buffer, that trapdoor, the actual constraint on the Australian government's idiocy is a lot kind of weaker than it could be in other countries that just don't have that kind of slack to play with. So what I worry about is that actually we could pretty easily go through another 1 or 2 COVID-like events. I mean, not maybe quite as bad as COVID, but maybe half as bad as COVID in terms of the, ridiculous amount of fiscal expenditure. But what will happen is we'll start losing people. If Australia continues on that path of idiocy, people will start leaving for other countries where their politicians are a little more constrained in the amount of idiocy they can implement on their countries, and where they have more freedom and they have more certainty that they're going to retain that freedom. Even in the US, for example, they never closed borders between states, right? Whereas we closed our state borders, right? That was really extreme, and it caused several people to directly die from that. But in the US, you've had variation from state to state. And of course, what we've seen post-COVID is that a lot of people have moved from places like California and New York to places like Texas and Florida, where they feel like they're going to be more able to count on their own freedom. And that's the kind of voting with your feet that I would expect to happen if Australia signs up to this sort of nonsense and goes ahead and, sacrifices billions or hundreds of billions of its dollars towards this kind of foolish errand of trying to, get to zero, passage of some respiratory virus or whatever it is, without recognizing, look, that is basically a dead-end strategy. The strongest thing you have in your arsenal is the human immune system. And the second strongest thing is interaction with other human beings. And those two things combined, recognizing how to support the immune system independently, and secondly, recognizing the incredible power of interacting with other people and being exposed to small levels of germs, non-lethal germs, as a kind of input to bolstering your immunity. Those two things they should be the center point of our kind of strategy about how to prepare for a respiratory virus or any other kind of communicable disease that's like that. There are other kinds of diseases, of course, and you have to treat them differently. But, that's how we should be thinking, not let's give lots of money to One Health and hope that they protect us. I mean, that's this kind of puerile, toddler-like attitude. I have to look to daddy to protect me, and he can't. Sorry, but daddy can't protect you. The thing that's going to protect you is your own health, right? And whether or not your society, your community is healthy. And so we just have to have a mindset shift about that. And I don't see it yet. So I do think, yes, the answer to the question is we could very well see the next decade go by with a couple more events, kind of like COVID, and we'll just get more and more depleted in terms of our wealth and our health and our population. We'll see birth rates declining. We'll see productivity continuing to slump. So we'll just make Australia much worse off. Eventually, I hope that things will start turning around. But it's going to take a lot more, because at the moment we're still too rich and we have too much slack in the system to really have to smell the coffee.
Do we have an idea on potential cost to farmers, specifically family farmers, when it comes to something like like a zoological spillover, and then a directive to say, right, we're going to have to cull all these chickens or cattle. What's the potential costs, and would they consider this from a World Health point of view,
Well,
the cost to local farmers?
yeah, I mean, if you look at what's happened in the U.S. with this, like with the bird flu culling of birds, for example, and also, by the way, the forced vaccination of birds, and also what happened to the mink during COVID, right? Everybody decided that the mink were the reservoir of concern, and so they all got executed, right? I mean, it's madness. And what happens in these cases is that somebody suggests a radical move, and because of the sort of political ability to argue for that move on the basis that you're going to save everybody from a very, fearsome pathogen, you can actually get away with it, and nobody really calls you on it. And the idea that maybe you should just let it play out and let a few birds die or a few cows die or whatever, and again, as with the human population, allow immunity to develop and study what's going on and figure out how to support the animals, right? All that stuff, it becomes the area of fringe beliefs and fringe arguments in the eyes of the mainstream. And I saw this during COVID. Again, I was arguing, well, okay, we are going to lose a few people from COVID if we, don't have the lockdowns. That's going to happen. Sorry, we lose a few people from a lot of things in the world. I want to lose as least people as possible. But as soon as you start saying, oh, a few people might die of COVID, you're branded a granite killer. So it was very clear how that argument worked. It was like, no, anything that would lose any lives, right, is just not acceptable, and we are not going to accept. It's just not on, and you're going to be branded somebody who hates people, basically, right? And so if you did this with the animals, you're literally potentially causing bankruptcy for any farmer who has a flock of or a herd of whatever animal it is that gets fingered for this. And I don't think that would count in the calculus. If the fear level is high enough, I don't think it would count to the politicians and even to a lot of the mainstream Australians. Because a lot of mainstream Australians don't have connections to farmers. They don't, the farmer's pain is not really directly felt by them. They see it at the grocery store, maybe with higher food prices, but they're not really, they're not family connected or otherwise connected to these farmers. And the farmers are in regional areas. They have their own communities, but they don't have much, in the way of lobbying power compared to a lot of other lobby groups, right? And the impact would basically just be higher food prices and the need to import more from overseas if we could. But of course, we have biosecurity restrictions, which prevent a lot of those kinds of imports of potential, competitive exporting countries like New Zealand bananas, let's say. And so we basically just end up making the Australian consumer worse off. It's just more of a cost of living problem, more depletion of our wealth and potentially our health as well. And you get less food security because you don't have that domestic source, and you have to then rely on other countries that may impose God knows what restrictions or decide they don't want to trade with us because they don't like us anymore or whatever. Not that I think we should be producing all of our own food, but I think it is very wise to have diversified supply chains, particularly for food. So you have some in the domestic market and you have some overseas. I think it is very plausible that we could see the same kind of idiocy, unless the farm lobby manages to get itself together and really push hard and make the argument, very strongly that we are not going to do this, and actually, may require physically just not complying with some of the government edicts. And I don't know if they would be prepared to do that.
Sorry to jump around a little bit. I did want to ask this after the previous question. In kind of returning to, I'm sure you would agree that we're obviously at risk of making some of the same mistakes in a similar situation to COVID. But what, in all of your kind of years of research, what do you think would be, or can you picture what the kind of cultural flashpoint would be for that mindset change? Do you think it really has to descend to a struggle for the majority of the population to get there, or are there historical examples of the right set of circumstances that kind of where we pivot and go take that ownership of ourselves?
Yeah, again, another great question. I mean, if I look at history, what tends to topple empires like the one that we see in Australia and many other places in the West, by the way, at the moment, where the elites are just making crazy decisions that are not in line with the needs of their population. What tends to stop that is total defeat on the battlefield, civil war, or some other extreme, destructive event, revolution sort of event. So I take the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Total defeat on the battlefield. There are many other examples from history, but that sort of, phenomenon, I'm not really seeing how that would eventuate for Australia. I do think that there is one element in the COVID sequelae that was not there in a lot of the previous times that we've been able to look at in history and say, well, when has an overly bureaucratized, out of touch elite been finally stopped by its people? Well, the COVID vaccines have been so widely distributed, and they're now in so many people. And people are slowly waking up to the poisonous nature of these substances. And I think that because they can't unvaccinate themselves, they will continue to carry that as a worry, as a concern, as a pain. And the more that they lose people around them, their children or their parents or their friends, colleagues, family members, I think the more there is an incentive for people to at least entertain the possibility that maybe the mainstream narrative that COVID was wrong. And so from a couple of years ago, I was blogging about this. I think one of the primary tools in our arsenal as people who are trying to advocate for change, and it's not a tool that I would have ever chosen, or I'm not happy to have it, but I think it is a tool, is the fact that so many people took these products, and there are going to be negative effects, and there already are. They're just not being well publicized in Australia. That we've lost, as you know, tens of thousands more people than we should have since mid-2021. Yeah. And the Department of Health is just going la about that. That should be the number one issue, occupying 80% of the Department of Health's time. Like, why are we losing so many people, right? That's just the Department of Health, right? You can't be healthy if you're dead. So I think that is something that will, kind of continue to unwind people's, strict adherence to the whole vaccine ideology stuff. And as that unwinds, perhaps there'll be a little bit of daylight that opens up for them to be able to accept alternative views of other things, lockdowns, the masking, just the idea of a one health system, which to me just sounds like another version of an empire. And a world empire is bad. It's bad news. It's a monopoly, right? In economics, we know that competition is good for people. That's why we want competitive nation states. We want lots of different countries doing things their own ways and let people choose, what they think is the most productive, most happy, most successful, and let there be a competition for those things that the populations egg their machinery of states on to produce for them. That's what creates human well-being. Having everybody unified in some big, world empire is the absolute opposite of what you want if you care about human welfare. So this One Health thing is just another, is just one brand of that sort of empire mentality. And so, yeah, I think I'm somewhat hopeful that the vaccine story will help us. But if you look in history, the only ways this sort of stuff comes to an end are pretty bloody and pretty nasty.
Yeah, I was a little concerned that was going to be the answer, because I'm like, Gigi and I spoke the other day, organizing a time for this interview, and one of the things that really resonated with me was like your outlook, Gigi, on this building a parallel system. But it's like after the kind of burnout and the fatigue of the last 5 years, to find the starting point for that, or like where you see it really grow and replicate across the kind of social sphere is very difficult to pinpoint. But I do like that idea. I've always kind of spoken about this exposing. So, with the vaccine injuries and deaths that have occurred, is like exposing the brutality of the state. So it's like that two-prong approach, and then building the parallel while that's, both doing both of those things simultaneously. What do you see that parallel system looking like? Can we offer a little bit of optimism of what that would look like in Australia with ASF's work so far?
Yeah, sure. I'll first say in terms of another domain that is more advanced in our kind of portfolio of stuff that we're working on, We have partnered with one of our founders to implement a new higher education experiment. It's called Academia Liberamentis, happening in Belgium. This co-founder of ASF and his wife bought a castle in the Ardennes region of Belgium, and they're running a new university there right now, writing a new textbook, basically trying to get away from some of the mainstream ways in which people are educated in tertiary institutions now. And of course, that's my bread and butter, being a tertiary educator now for 20 years or so. So, we are actually on the ground experimenting with something, not in Australia, but someplace where, it was feasible to get a castle. You don't have any castles in Australia. If somebody wants to give me a farm or something for free, then fine. I'll be happy to try to start a new university there. But I mean, the reality is we just don't have the kind of funding that you would need to really start up a new university here. In terms of health, I want to go back to something you said about, where could the new system sort of start to take hold? And I think it's in the communities. And this is also true to an extent with education, particularly lower than tertiary education. It's communities that start to accept onto their own shoulders the responsibility for their own happiness more than the sort of current paradigm then that says, oh, you should look to the government to do something about all of the problems you have, because that's the typical narrative you get in the media, right? If you have a cost of living problem, if you have a problem with your undiagnosed whatever health problem, if you have problems with the aged care system, the answer is always, what's the government going to do about this, right? That's always how it goes. That's how the narrative proceeds immediately, almost as if there's no power of markets, there's no power of people. It's incredibly disempowering, that message, to the individual person or the individual community that might be tuning in. So we need to stop that, our own mind, stop that narrative and replace it with a narrative that says, no, you know what? I can do some things that will directly create more thriving of people in my family, in my community, in my neighborhood. And I don't need the government to give me permission. And I don't need the government to give me really anything. I can just start doing it. And I've seen that happen in a few communities in Australia, particularly one up in Avalon, that started kind of as a group of friends before COVID, but then grew during COVID because it was sort of bring a friend every other week or something to this group discussion of what was happening. And they grew and grew to, I don't know, they have like 80 or 100 people now, and they have community gardening, and they have community events, and they have, people getting jobs from other people, and they have education. During the lockdowns, they had kids who are going from home to home being taught whatever it was that the person in that home was a specialist in: music, math, phys ed, whatever. And that was I found that to be very inspiring as a model. And these people have, really deep connections to each other. They're joyful, they're happy, they're not doom and gloom, oh my gosh, everything's going to hell kind of people, right? It's more, look, we have the opportunity to build a better community for ourselves and build more human thriving in our community. Why do we not want to just do that? That's something that's exciting, fulfilling. It gives you meaning. It brings you closer to people. It's joyful. There was a barn dance the other night that we went to, and that, was the same kind of idea, bringing community together. Have a dance, get the young people together to meet each other. We know the fertility rate's tanking. Partly it's because men and women aren't meeting each other anymore, right? Or they're so ill from the vaccine side effects that they don't want to, get the booty on. So, all these things actually, we could do at the local level. Matchmaking, right? Set up a matchmaking service for these young people. So we need to take the opportunities and the responsibility, indeed, that we have for making a better life for ourselves and our kids seriously. We have to take that seriously and stop this business of, let me see what the government's going to do for me next. Because that's almost like a JFK thing. Ask not, what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. What can you do for your people? For your people, the people in Australia whom you love, you're in this country, hopefully you love them, or at least you love the people in your immediate surroundings. Help them to get together again, help them to feel joy together, help them to get over that burnout that you mentioned, which is very palpable. Support them to get better medical care and all the things they want. Get your head out of the phone and the social media, landscape of hell, and actually engage with your communities, because that is the way that we can start piloting and trialing things. Now, the health, in the health dimension, I think one of the biggest things that I've seen is an explosion in interest by many, many people in Australia in how do I keep myself healthy? How do I detox from the spike protein? How do I, treat my cancer in a non, sort of chemo and radiation sort of standard therapy way? And all that stuff is great. And we have several organizations that cater directly for that in Australia, like the Australian Medical Network. They have AMN, they have master classes every other week or so, I think, and they bring on people to talk about particular things. I think that's a great initiative that pushes information out to the individual people and gives people ideas about, okay, how could we get this information and this treatment protocol, to more people who may need it. And, we've thought about that at ASF as well, more community-based, community-led monitoring of health, fewer hospitals, and certainly better hospitals. So, natural light in the hospitals, better nutrition in the hospitals.
Linen sheets, if I can interject.
What's that?
I said linen sheets, if I can interject. Oh, because there's a frequency of fabrics, and we used to have linen sheets in hospitals, and we would push patients out to the sunshine, but now it's all plastic-based, and that can actually have an impact on your ability to heal.
Jeez.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Strange thing.
There's lots of soft plastics. Yeah, lots of soft plastics that are used in hospitals. And we all know hospital food is so horrific, and all the unnatural lighting. I mean, there's just so many things. And you can't sleep because things are beeping all the time in the night. I mean, it's the place that you least want to be if you really need to heal.
The food they give people in there.
Right?
Absurd. Like my mum's been in for some very serious things the last few years, and there's the things that they're giving her. I'm like, you are contributing to the downfall. I don't understand this.
It's, I believe, this is a kind of local example, but I think during the pandemic, they consolidated all of our hospital food and prison food. So that was all coming out of the same kitchen.
Oh my God.
Which, there's a social tone to that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But, well, so Gigi, I'm interested as well, I suppose, in terms of your day job and being in a traditional tertiary environment. And, there's this thing of it's been kind of captured ideologically. Are you seeing what are you seeing in attitudes towards these issues now? Is there a broadening in terms of being allowed to think differently? Or do you feel like that cohort are still very focused and doubling down because, once you've gone a certain length and called someone a granny killer, it's a little bit hard to have the humility to apologize and atone. So I'm just wondering, what's the current state of the student landscape and teaching landscape?
Well, it's very different depending on if you're talking about the academic staff or the students.
I would like to hear about both.
Academic staff. Yeah, so the academic staff, in fact, one of the people in my department was probably Australia's most outspoken pro-lockdown advocate during COVID. And he just does not talk to me or meet my eyes or anything at all, right, anymore. Like at our last Christmas party, he was noticeably staying as far physically from me as he possibly could in the room for the entire time. So I feel like I'm kind of like kryptonite to him, it's like I just can't, but he and other people who, were advocating for all the nonsense in the mainstream are the ones who are being rewarded by the government grants and the awards and all these other stupid things, right? So it's very frustrating because I kind of want to say that's not the right person to give this to. This person has shown himself not to be able to be a scientist when the chips are down, when it really counts. This person just went along with mad policies and didn't have the humility to recognize that maybe he was mistaken, and to actually have a conversation about what we should do, an open conversation. He was just trying to cancel people. That's not scientific.
Do you think they actually think they are, or have an understanding or awareness that they were wrong, or do you think they're staunch, head in the sand, completely ignorant to the fact that they've probably contributed to the lies themselves?
It's a very good question, and I think again it depends on the person. I think for the most part, people want to think of themselves as good people, and so they will have a narrative in their head that supports that image. So it'll be, well, I did the best I could at the time. I advocated for things that, the experts were telling me were good. I was, following the science as I was told it by people in authority. I should not have had to have somehow questioned the people who were telling me that these things were true and necessary, because, I trusted my society to tell me. And so I have no personal culpability. Like that's, I think, a lot of what they'll say to themselves. And even if they do admit that, okay, maybe we went overboard with the lockdowns and maybe, not everybody needed to get the vaccines. Obviously now we've rolled them back rolled back the recommendation for the children, very quietly, right, on the website or TGA or whatever it is. And nobody advertised that very broadly, but they're saying exactly what we were saying 2-3 years ago, which was that risks are too great relative to the potential benefit, because the potential benefit is basically nil, right, for a healthy young person. So I think it will mainly be a self-preservation story, justification story that runs in their heads about how they couldn't have known, or there was some other excuse for why they did what they did. Now, that doesn't mean that they are completely comfortable having an open conversation about what happened, because of course it may happen that their story unravels in the cold light of truth about really what we knew back then. Because I can tell you, we knew in March 2020 that it was not going to be a good idea to lock people down, right? I knew that. I could see that was the case from just looking at the data that was coming in even then. And the Ruby Princess and all the other sources of information that we had as a scientist, you could look at that and say, right, and look at the pandemic management policy and say, right, lockdowns, bad idea. You could immediately say that. So I think there is a deep fear somewhere, which is connected with the ego, in some of the people who, particularly those who really advocated strongly for the lockdowns and masking and all the other stuff, that prevents them from being able to engage. And I honestly think if they really were to see the reality, some of these people would probably just die on the spot. They would have such a heart attack, because they really, really need to think of themselves as good people. And the idea that they created destruction, that they're advocating for things that were a bad idea during COVID, may have directly killed multiple people, that's just too much of a shock to their own sense of who they are. Yeah. Now, I also think there is a layer of people who are kind of psychopathic and sociopathic, who just don't really care about the human consequences and just were like, oh no, I was going for my profit, that's fine. And we talk about those people as well a little bit in the Great COVID Panic, my first COVID book, co-authored with Paul Frieders and Michael Baker. But I think that number of people is reasonably low. I think most people, I basically believe in the goodness of most people. They want to think of themselves as good. They want to be seen as good by others. And so that's what generates the effort in the mind to, come up with these stories and self-preserving stories. Now, so that's the academic staff. There will be some academic staff who weren't quite as vocal. And I have had a couple of people of that type approach me over the last year or so, asking to actually have a bit of a conversation about some of the stuff, because they're starting to see that maybe I had a point, kind of thing. And so I try to treat those people with as much patience as I possibly can. Of course, thank you for coming to me. It's great that you're interested. Here's the situation. And then, of course, you get all the standard arguments. Well, but the hospitals would have overrun. Oh, but then they wouldn't have been able to get to the hospital. Oh, but then we would have had to let it rip, and then blah, 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 all the standard stuff. But that's just sort of a gradual process. And for those people, I think there's probably a little more hope, because they are able to be open, because they haven't bound their own ego so much in everything. Now, the students.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I've got a quiet faith in the students, because I hope you're about to confirm it, because I really see, I'm like a younger millennial, I was born 93, and I really see that generation as the most captured in this kind of participation award. Everyone needs to be treated the same. Government, please help me. But this younger gen that's coming through, it's sad, because it's like I'm going, are so disillusioned because they don't know a world that was pre-internet. And so they kind of catch it out a little bit quicker. And I'm hoping you're about to tell me that that is the case.
Yeah, what I have seen in my classrooms is almost, I would say, a desperate hunger for an authentic conversation about big issues that are facing the country, including what just happened with COVID. And also, what's happening with the tariffs, or what's happening with, the housing crisis. They want honesty and scientific approaches, balance. They want real conversation. They are gagging for it, because they just don't get it, right? They have so much ideology, in their classrooms and in their social media groups, so much virtue signaling, so much fakery. And now they got AI fakery too. They're swimming in a world of fake. And people don't thrive like that. And they recognize at some level, even if they're not articulating it to themselves, they'll know implicitly that this is not right. This feels icky. It feels shallow. It feels like we're not able to make any progress. We're all just sort of treading water and hoping that, the image that we have of ourselves or other people will be maintained. That's no way to make progress in this world. You have to face the reality. So I found in my teaching, students are actually, they specifically asked me at the end of my last class, they said, look, we really want to have a conversation about COVID policy, and we really want to have a conversation about tariff policy. Those were the two things they were particularly interested in. So we had a 45-minute conversation about these things, and people got to express their different views and their different perspectives, and I got to converse about some of these frequently expressed reservations about not having done the lockdowns. Well, if we hadn't, it said that we would have, the model said that we would have lost X number of people. Why is that wrong? Okay, let's think about what was in these models, right? And you get to actually have a conversation. They love it. And the room, you can hear a pin drop with those kinds of conversations. If you're really being honest, and if you've created the safety in that space, a real safe space, to actually just say what's on your mind, and we'll deal with it, and we'll deal with it respectfully and openly, and we'll try to get to some notion of, okay, maybe this is the most likely true situation. We never get to truth, but what's the most likely truth at this moment, considering everything we've discussed, and we know, have we made some progress in our understanding of things? Have we educated ourselves and also connected with other people in the room? That's another thing they're so, eager for, is actual conversation, meaningful conversation with other human beings. Because of course they don't get it online often, and they're just not very good at it sometimes because they've had 5 years of being cooped up, or 4 years anyway, not really doing the normal things that young people do. So I am like you. I'm very hopeful about the young people, and I do think we need to get them more involved in the rebuilding effort, because after all, it's going to be their future, and they but they need to have that mindset shift as well, that they can take responsibility, they can be an agent of change. Like really back yourself. Be confident and back yourself. And there is a community now to join. Join ANSEP, join ANSEP, join the alternative whatever organization or media space. There was a 24-year-old who interviewed me on a podcast he's starting up the other day. And it's like, great, you're starting to try to, really get into serious issues, and you're a young person, and just like you guys, it's great. I just think that's exactly what we need.
Well, I think it's reflective on I guess what you're touching on there is our podcast and a lot of other podcasts starting to show up everywhere, and it's because there's a thirst for information that's not necessarily just what you're seeing on the mainstream media, on the news, in the paper. People are hungry for that sort of information, and that's good to see that. I mean, our demographic is, I think, largely like 24 to 44. That's about 80% of our demographic, which is reasonably young. And that's and we talk a lot of these sorts of topics, so there is a thirst for that, and that's great to see that we're seeing it in the students and even the younger generations coming up. What's been the response when you've started to talk this through with the students? Has there been any pushback, or are they just thirsty for it?
They just want to have a conversation. I try, of course, very much to not be an ideologue myself, right? Not just try to shove down my view about what's happened into people's, throats, because that's not my role as a teacher, right? My role as a teacher is show you where to look, consider this, consider that, and give some information, of course. And I've written copiously on the COVID period, and everybody can look that up. But I want to help them walk through the logic. How would an economist approach this question? Because, of course, it's an economics class, right? So how does an economist think about evaluating policy? And I do this in the high school competitions that I run as well. Think about how an economist would conceptualize this problem. What is the framework that he or she would use? How do you, evaluate these things? And free of political, ideology and, self-serving stuff and virtue signaling. Forget about all that stuff. Just put it to one side, all the stuff that infuses the mainstream news, and be an objective, as you can be, economist, advocating for the welfare of all people in the country. Right? That is the position that I'm always trying to enforce. And because you basically, that's kind of unarguable. A lot of young people, or any people, when you're arguing, saying to them, okay, well, look, what are you maximizing? If you're maximizing the welfare of the whole country, and you can plausibly show how the things you're advocating for would increase welfare, which is what I try to do, it's kind of over. I mean, that's what then you have a conversation about whether or not those are the right policies. But the ultimate objective is the welfare of the Australian people. You don't hear this very much, actually, in the mainstream. You often just hear people advocating for something and stopping short of connecting whatever they're advocating to, the welfare of the people in Australia. But that's really where you have to go, right? And I find a lot of times what people think they're maximizing is not really what they're maximizing in their arguments or in their, because they tell themselves that this is what they're doing, but they're not really. And if they were to query it a little bit and actually walk through the logic, they'd realize, like the One Health stuff, how exactly is that going to make Australia healthier? How exactly? You tell me, what is the mechanism through which more surveillance around respiratory diseases is really going to make us better off, considering all the other things we have to spend on, considering, all the other health areas and the costs of the surveillance, how much benefit would we reasonably predict from this? We have an example of COVID. You can see from that, how big could this benefit be in the case of a bug like COVID? You just have to do the actual rational analysis instead of just accepting it like an article of religious doctrine. And so that, I think they respond well to. If I were to go and just, go on a, spree of, oh my gosh, everybody took the wrong decision during COVID. I was right all along, and I can't believe these stupid people, then I probably wouldn't get a good reaction, right? So obviously I don't do that.
So when we come to specific costs, and we may have touched it, do we have any numbers and figures that potential costs to the taxpayer, ongoing, and what that's going to cost potentially upfront, short term and long term?
I mean, I'm hesitant to predict that because, as we've said, that there's pretty much an unfunded, not specified in these IHR things, and that's why it's so dangerous. The pandemic treaty and then all these things, they're dangerous because they sign us up to something we don't know how much it's going to cost us. It's kind of like the vaccine makers' indemnity clauses. You're indemnified against any damage. Well, that's just a massive, unquantified, unfunded obligation, liability, right? And that's what we're signing up for here if we were to go ahead with this pandemic treaty nonsense. So I'm kind of, even like in the case of the vaccine indemnity thing, I think I put a submission into, or ASF put a submission into the Senate inquiry about this. And I think we came up with an, ballpark estimate or minimum estimate of like $2 billion. But this is very shaky because we don't know how many people might be damaged by, X number of vaccines or whatever, and how serious would the bug be in the future that the WHO decides to call a pandemic or whatever. So, but certainly if you look at COVID, I mean, it's hundreds of billions of dollars that we were willing to spend. We did spend, along with so many other countries in the West. So you certainly see that as plausible, and that's catastrophic. That's catastrophic for the withdrawal of funds from everything else that we could spend on, from the perspective of our sovereign debt rating. Even we've seen the U.S. have a problem with that, right? And even now, Trump is having this big beautiful bill discussion, and the debt ceiling is part of that. And the more you raise your debt ceiling, the more you borrow, the more people are going to be wondering whether you can pay it back. That's just how it works, and it's true. You don't have to pay it back all in 1 year. And it doesn't work just like a household from that perspective. But eventually, the chickens come home to roost if everybody else doesn't go into the same amount of debt, which, of course, is the case, right? So that sort of relative position of your country relative to other ones, that's what often matters in terms of capital flight and attraction of capital and whatnot. So the more we bleed to these kinds of initiatives, the more, we are imperiling Australia's wealth and an ability to grow in the future. So, yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the nature of the pathogen. It depends on what kind of actions are being requested. But I think at a minimum, we would definitely be thinking of something in the order of billions of dollars to just set up the infrastructure that is, being stipulated, or at least do some sort of, lip service to setting that infrastructure up. If we wanted to do the minimum that we would need to in order to comply with the pandemic policy or pandemic treaty policies, it would be in the billions anyway. And then it could be much more, depending on what happens down the track.
Something like this it seems so illogical, the way it's being handled and what they're trying to implement, that it feels quite sinister by design to be that illogical. It does feel like and that's tinfoil hat on, and I don't like to, when talking about something serious like this, to edge into that conspiracy style of thinking, but you have to start to go and question, like, if it is this illogical and everyone can see it, that has to be by design.
So, I mean, the word illogical is an interesting one to choose there. I think it's actually quite logical from an alternative perspective where you're not maximizing human welfare. They're just not maximizing that. So, that's the mirage. That's the packaging. It says it on the label. But if you go into the package and look at what's actually, what are the ingredients of what's included in that product, it's nothing that actually plausibly could truly advance human health. I just don't, for all the arguments we've said before, I just don't see that that's the case. So what we have here is, we talk about gilding the lily or whatever, or, something that's very much not about promoting health being wrapped up in pretty paper and sold to us as being about promoting health. And of course, some of the people in the system who are promoting this really believe in that connection. I think they just haven't queried it enough. Like something like, vaccines are always good for people's health. That kind of, dogmatic statement is pretty much accepted at face value by a large fraction of the population of the world, right? Just because we've been, it's been added into our so many years. And unless you really stop and say, whoa, okay, I'm actually going to allow myself to think about whether this is true and look at the research myself and do this and do that, huge amount of effort, right? You're just going to accept that. And so the connection between the package label and what's in the package is accepted on face value. And so that, I think, is a lot of what's happening. So that explains many of the layers of actions that we're seeing both in Australia and also overseas. In terms of the people at the very tops of the industries that are going to benefit, well, for them, of course, it makes sense. It's very logical. It's very profitable, right? It's very profitable. And it also is very profitable in terms of their status, right? Their image as good people and all this. As long as, we continue this mindset of, vaccines are always good and more spending on health always gives more health, right? Those kinds of just accepted dogmatic truths. As long as a lot of people believe those things, then as long as you spend more on health, or you advocate for spending more on vaccines, or you advocate for spending more on whatever thing is believed in, then you're going to have higher status and more profit as well. So again, there's kind of a duplicity of mind on the part of a lot of these people. I do think, as I said to you before, there's some psychopaths and some sociopaths out there. And, maybe Tedros is one of them, maybe Gates is one of them. There's certain people, Burla, whatever, who I think probably do see some of the reality and they just don't care. They actually just literally don't care about the people. But I think many, many people in the system, it's not like that. And, I've obviously had this conversation about, has it all been planned? Is it all the population agenda? Is it, going back to, Event 201 and all this sort of stuff? I personally don't think that this whole thing has been planned and then, there's been some cabal like a James Bond, evil dude or a collection of people for many, many years, for years and years, because it's just very difficult to keep that sort of organization going when you have so many other local incentives and you have so much unpredictability in what's actually going to happen. I mean, look at economists. We can't predict, 3 years in the future. We predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, as the joke goes, right? You can't predict what's going to happen, really. But you can certainly follow incentives. And there are huge amounts of incentives, both in terms of money and in terms of status, that are now pushing strongly and hard on people in positions of power in relation to health, whether it's the pharmaceutical industries or the departments of health around the world in the West or the politicians. And those incentives cannot be denied. Those are very, very strong incentives, and they're parallel throughout the world. And so you see this concomitant willingness to just sacrifice wealth and health on that altar, the altar of that package label.
Well, I'm conscious of your time, and unless Chloe has anything else she wants to touch on, I do have one final couple of things. I always like to leave listeners with trying to take something tangible for them home instead of just an echo chamber of people discussing things. Is what can the listener at home do to potentially? Is it as simple as not comply? Is it do your own research? As cliche as that sounds, what can the listener at home do in regards to a situation like this?
I think the most important thing is to find ways to reestablish and strengthen and rejuvenate community in whatever way you can. And so we have tried to do that with ASF. And if you want to know what we're doing, you can subscribe to our newsletters. We send out monthly newsletters. If you belong to ASF, you get a monthly members forum, which platforms people in Australian communities we think are doing good things aligned with ASF's mission. You can come to our in-person events. We have one next week, actually, on the evening of Monday, the 7th of July at Sydney Masonic Centre. It's a big dialogue on the cost of living problem. I'll be emceeing, and we have Cameron Murray and as the moderator, and then Adam Crichton as one of the panelists. He was a writer in The Australian and actually, very much anti-COVID lockdowns during that time. And now he's at the IPA as a chief economist. And Alison Preston, who's a professor at UWA, and Jennifer Westacott, who's a chancellor of Western Sydney University. So it's aiming to be an across-the-aisles discussion of the cost of living problem. We may end up covering some of the territory about, whether or not some of the problem we're having is a result of mismanaged policy, a few years ago. So come out to events like that and support your local community in whatever way that you can. So people have different skill sets, they have different interests, they have different experience, they can't all do the same thing. And they shouldn't. We don't want that, right? Diversity is humanity's greatest strength in some ways. And so you definitely want to find what you're good at and then deploy those skills to the extent that you can in a sustainable fashion. Don't deplete yourself and get burned out, right? So take care of yourself, but deploy them in a way that helps to build community, helps to give people hope and joy and strength, and helps them come together, helps them to think about the future in a positive way and take more responsibility for building that future. That mindset shift is basically not achievable without a lot of different conversations happening all over Australia, around the dinner table, at the water coolers and wherever else you can, to try to wake people up to their responsibility, and don't just accept this narrative of the government's going to save us or the government has to do things to fix our problems. You've got the government, you've got, just move on, think about what you can do. And everybody can be part of that effort depending on where you are. So if people want to look at ASF, it's scienceandfreedom.org. Just sort of the words written out, scienceandfreedom.org. And you can, subscribe, you can join us. We're having a movie screening in September, in addition to the big dialogue on cost of living. Next Monday, we're having a movie screening the 10th of September, COVID Collateral. It's a documentary film from Canada. It'll be at the Sydney Fox Studios Hoyts Cinema. And then we're also having our annual conference here in Sydney in November. So that's the 21st to the 23rd of November. Very exciting lineup of things happening there, including designing future systems and talking about how to improve human welfare in the various areas that our constituency is interested in, which is really across many different disciplines and, different areas of expertise. And we really like to have the community there because we listen to our community. We are guided by what our community needs. So, there's a lot of opportunity. And if you don't find what you like on the existing kind of menu of community organizations, start your own.
Chloe, anything you want to finish on or ask? Or?
No, I'm just so grateful for the conversation. I love that it's not just a financial cost, but also a kind of mental and social one as well. And I think, it's probably that's the more important one to discuss. And I'm just, very thankful for you joining us today, Gigi. Thank you.
Certainly appreciate your time. And, mate, if you're ever in town and want to jump on and have a more in-depth conversation, these remote viewing, I'm not a CIA. These remote interviews are always a little bit more of an interview, but in person, having a chat would be great. So if you're ever in town, drop in. Anything you want to plug to finish? Nothing? All good? Or?
No, just, those events and, give people hope. Australia is still a great country, and you got to back yourself for being able to, create such a good place. And we will be able to fix this, but we just have to all work together. So, don't give up.
Perfect. Appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Cheers. All right. Now we're going to just do, it's like
now we have to wait around
3-minute intro, okay. And then you might have to hang around for another 15 minutes after.
So once the intro is done, I think you can just mute your microphone and turn off your camera, but keep the browser open until that upload is 100% complete.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yep. No worries.
All right, Ardianas. Today we are joined by Gigi Foster, but before we get into what we spoke about and our guest, this episode is brought to you by alltradescover.com.au. If you're watching at home, you see behind Chloe All Trades logo there, but All Trades Cover, they cover you if you're a big tradie, small tradie, medium tradie, whatever sort of construction work you've got going, they're going to be able to give you a competitive quote. Your best bet is to call them up and then explain your situation, because the majority of them have been tradies in the past and understand what you're actually talking about. They're not just men in suits and women in suits, and they like to they get out on site and really assess the situation, making sure you're covered fully for everything that you really need that coverage for. So hit them up, drop our name. It really helps us. And what helps us helps get more content out like this. And these sorts of conversations are very important. This episode's also brought to you by Crafted Finance. Finance obviously being a big part of this conversation and how we're going to be going with the cost. But finance or Crafted Finance, they are people who are basically disillusioned with the banking system and saw a lot of people falling into the traps of just getting a loan for the sake of getting a loan, not understanding the long-term implications and the interest they're going to have to pay. So instead of just leaving, they decided to start their own business and make sure people get the best deal possible over the term of the loan. They will present you with all of the options, not just get you in there so they get their payday. Really like that. They're very like-minded. They're listeners and very good people. So again, drop our name, Hard Yarns. You'll get the website through the show notes and our Instagram bio. You can find all your access points there. Hit them up, Crafted Finance, drop our name. And they're definitely going to look after you. But we were joined for the third episode in this three-part series on the pandemic treaty. Chloe, you joined us as always for this. But we were also joined by Gigi Foster over in Sydney, I think, at the moment, you said. So if you could give us a brief rundown on who you are and what we spoke about today.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Gigi Foster. I'm a professor in the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney. And we talked about the cost of the pandemic treaty and sort of One Health orientation. And more broadly, not just the financial costs, potential scale of those, but also the impact on our society and sort of our communities moving forward, and the need to really dream about alternative ways of doing things instead of just throwing tomatoes against the nonsense that we're seeing issuing from the lips of our leaders, both here and abroad. We need to be the place where new ideas are generated about what we'd actually like to see in place of these kinds of treaties, these kinds of approaches to supposedly safeguarding health. What would a better health system look like? And the same question for many other areas of our society.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And any listeners at the start, you might hear a bit of an air blower, a leaf blower in the background, but if you can persevere for the first 5 minutes, that's gone pretty quickly. I really appreciate your time and being here with us. So without further ado, let's get hard. That's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, no worries.
Yes.
So it says here 51% uploading.
Yeah, that's the one. So what's it? Everyone else is still being recorded. Refresh. So you need to stop the recording from your end, I think.
Oh, do I? Okay.
Yeah, because mine stopped from mine, but I recorded in a separate one. So I'm.
How do I do that? I see the thing that says rec at the top, but I don't see a button that says anything other than I see something that says 51% uploading, but that's not a button.
Okay. Oh, it's your